All right, ladies and gentlemen, today we are going to take a look at how a negative slope will change the graph of an equation. And by the end of this lesson, you will all be able to recognize what happens when we have a negative slope. And this simply means that we are going to examine when m in the slope-intercept form equation y equals mx plus b is less than or equal to 0. So let's take a look at our first graph. Y equals negative 1x plus 0. In order to keep everything else the same, we're going to keep the b value, or the y-intercept, at 0, which should already tell you that our first point is going to be the origin, because our y-intercept is 0. Okay, but our slope is going to be a negative 1, or the m value. So in order to solve this, we're going to have to start by putting in the actual value for x. And the first value we're going to start with, we're going to use a number that's easy to work with, like 1. So we take negative 1 times the value of 1 and then add 0 to it. And a negative times a positive is equal to a negative, so we get the y value of negative 1. And then we continue this for the next one. And next we're going to use 2 for our x value. So I have negative 1 times a 2 and then add 0. And negative 1 times 2 is, again, a negative times a positive is a negative value. So we get negative 2 as our y value. And finally, we'll try the value of 3. So we have negative 1 times 3. A negative times a positive is a negative, and we get negative 3 as our answer. So once we've worked this out and filled out our xy table, then I'm going to come over and actually plot my points. So I have 0, 0. The next I have 1, negative 1. Then I have 2. I go 2 to the right and down 2. Then I have 3, negative 3, which would be right here. And you can kind of see the pattern that's going on. And we're going to have a point right here, a point right here. Whatever the x value is, y is actually going to be the opposite. So if the x value is a negative value, then the opposite would be the positive. And we can go ahead and connect those with our line graph, and we'll make that yellow. So here we go, connect those points, and now we add the arrows to the end, and you just graphed your first equation with a negative slope. Moving on to the next one. Whoops. So we're going to graph this one. Alright, the first thing we want to do again is start with an easy x value of 0. And when x is 0, 0 times any number equals 0. So our y value is going to end up equaling 0 as well. Then we use another x value, again keeping the numbers as simple as possible. And this number 1 works really well with this equation. So negative 2 times 1, and then if we're adding 0, of course that's not going to make a difference because of our identity property of addition, but a negative times a positive is a negative. So my value here would be negative 2. And then I'm going to try the next one. I'm going to put a 2 in this time. So I have negative 2 times 2 plus 0. And we get negative 4 as our answer. And then I'm going to try a 3. When I put that in again, I have negative 2 times 3 to figure out my y value. A negative times a positive again is going to give us a negative answer, and that's negative 6. Now I come over and I can plot my points. So I have 0, 0, then I have over 1, and down 2. Then I have over 2 and down 4. Over 3 and down 6. And again, you can kind of see the pattern that's going on. So when I go over 4, I'm going to go down 8. When I go over 6, I'm actually going to go down twice that, which would be 12. And then just the opposite in the other direction. So if I go over 2, I'm going to go up 4. If I go left 4, then I'm going to go up to 8. And if I go left 6, I'm going to go up to 12 and simply connect those points with our line. And there we just made our graph for a slope of -2. Let's go ahead and take a look at the next one. So now we have an m value of -4. And we're going to do the same thing. I start with 0, and when my x value is 0, 0 times -4 is equal to 0. So now I use another number, like 1, because it's an easy number. It works well with this equation. 1 times -4 is -4. And then I'm going to try number 2. 2 times -4. Again, a negative times a positive gives us a negative answer, -8. And finally, 3 times -4 is -12. And we can graph these points. If you want, when you're making your XY table, you can also use like an x value of -1. In that case, a negative times a negative is a positive, so you'd end up with +4. And that might help you to graph points on both sides of the x-axis. But we'll graph our first point, and then we're going to go over 1 and down 4, because I have 1, -4. And then I'm going to go over 2 and down 8, because I have 2, -8. And then I have 3, -12 here. And I can do the same in the other direction. If I go left 1, then I'm going to go up 4. So it's just the opposite here. If I go over to -2, then I'm going to go up to a +8. And if my x value is -3, my y value is going to be a +12. And I'm ready to actually connect those dots. And now we have our next graph. And we move on. Now since we have a -1/2, we're still going to start with 0, and we're going to get our y value of 0. But this time we want a number that works well with -1/2, or with 1/2. Instead of using 1 and getting a 0.5 as our value for y, we'll start with 2. Half of 2 is 1, and of course since it's a negative times a positive, we get -1. And then we're going to use a number like 4. Half of 4 is 2. So those two numbers work pretty well together. And a negative times a positive gives us a -2. And again, this time I'm just going to use 12 so I can come way out on my graph. And half of 12 is 6. But since there's one negative, it's a -6. And I can graph that line just like I've done my others. I just put my plot, and I'm going to go ahead all the way to an x value of 12 and a -6 on my y value. And I'm going to do the same thing in the opposite direction. The opposite of 12 is -12, and the opposite of -6 is +6. And I have my line right here. Add those arrows on the end. And move on to the next one. And here, now we have -1/5. Again, I'm going to start with the same numbers that I've used in the past. And 0 times anything is 0. Then we have a number that works well with 1/5, like 5. Because 1/5 of 5 is 1. And since one of the numbers is negative, it's a -1. The next value I'm going to use is, again, something that works well with 1/5. So I'm going to try 10. 1/5 of 10 is 2. And again, it's a -2 because a negative times a positive is a negative. And finally, I'm going to go to -10. And we end up with 2. So all I have to do is graph those points and connect the dots. And we have our line graph right here. Now, if you could take a look and see if you can notice what the graphs with the negative slope do. How do they differ? How is that different from a positive slope? Alright, well, I hope this helped you out with understanding graphs and a negative slope or a negative m value. See ya!